The silence in Soohyun's apartment was broken only by the occasional sound of paper shuffling across her desk. The living room, once a place of comfort, had transformed into a fortress of isolation. Stacks of unread books created makeshift walls around her workspace, their spines facing away as if they too had turned their backs on her. Her laptop screen displayed a blank document, its cursor blinking steadily, a rhythm that matched her shallow breathing. And if you want a handsome CEO in your life and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The morning light filtered through partially closed blinds, casting striped shadows across scattered manuscript pages. These weren't her writings, but rejection letters from publishers, each one a reminder of her stalled career. Soohyun's fingers hovered over her keyboard, trembling slightly before dropping to her lap. The wedding photo on her desk had been turned face down weeks ago, but its presence still weighed heavily in the room. Her phone buzzed again, the fourth time that hour. She didn't need to check it to know it was another concerned friend trying to reach out. The device eventually fell silent, adding to the growing list of unanswered calls and messages. Food delivery containers from 3 days ago remained untouched on her coffee table, their contents long since spoiled. The memory of that day invaded her thoughts without warning. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unusually warm for spring. Dong-hyun had returned home early from work, his usual confident demeanor replaced by nervous energy. She remembered how he'd paced the living room, his shoes leaving scuff marks on the hardwood floor, marks that were still visible from where she sat. "I need to tell you something," he had said, his voice cracking. "I've fallen in love with someone else." The pause that followed felt eternal. "It's your mother." The coffee mug she'd been holding shattered against the floor. She remembered watching the brown liquid seep into the cracks between the floorboards, spreading like the truth that was destroying her world. Dong-hyun continued speaking, his words becoming a distant buzz in her ears. Something about how it had developed gradually, how they hadn't meant for it to happen, how sorry they both were. That moment replayed in her mind constantly, each time bringing fresh waves of nausea. Now, weeks later, Soohyun's apartment had become both sanctuary and prison. The walls seemed to close in with each passing day, yet she couldn't bring herself to leave. Outside these walls lay a world where people might know, where they might whisper and stare, where she might run into them. Her therapist had called it a trauma response, this self-imposed isolation. But understanding the clinical term didn't make it any easier to bear. The betrayal had carved itself into every aspect of her daily life. She couldn't write anymore. Every story seemed to circle back to themes of betrayal and loss. Her publisher's deadline for her next novel had come and gone, marked only by a brief email expressing their understanding of her situation. The stack of unopened mail on her entryway table grew taller each day. Bills, promotional flyers, and what looked like a letter from her mother all remained sealed, existing in a limbo of unaddressed reality. Her friends had tried intervention-style visits in the first few weeks, but Soohyun had mastered the art of pretending not to be home. The only person she still responded to was her therapist, and only through text messages. Even those conversations were becoming increasingly one-sided, with Soohyun's replies growing shorter and more distant. The suggested daily activities, writing exercises, short walks, calling a friend, remained unticked on her to-do list. As evening approached, Soohyun moved from her desk to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. The city continued its normal rhythm below, Una, where, or uncaring of her personal tragedy. People walked their dogs, couples held hands, delivery motorcycles zipped between cars. The normalcy of it all felt like a personal affront. Her reflection in the window glass showed a stranger, someone with hollow cheeks and dark circles under their eyes. She hadn't properly dressed in days, existing in a rotation of old sweaters and yoga pants. Her long black hair, once meticulously maintained, hung limp and unwashed around her face. The sound of a couple's laughter drifted up from the street, causing her to flinch and step back from the window. She retreated to her bedroom, where the blinds remained permanently drawn. Here, surrounded by the familiar shadows of her self-imposed exile, Soohyun could pretend the outside world didn't exist. that her mother hadn't betrayed her in the most fundamental way possible, that her marriage hadn't ended in a way that felt like a cruel joke. The bookstore's warmth hit Soo-yeon like a wall as she stepped inside, escaping the autumn chill. Her therapist's insistence on this exposure therapy felt like torture, but she had finally relented after weeks of refusing to leave her apartment. The familiar smell of paper and coffee from the store's cafe provided an unexpected comfort, reminding her of times before everything fell apart. She moved through the aisles mechanically, her fingers trailing along book spines without really reading their titles. The store was relatively empty at this hour, allowing her to maintain the invisible barrier she'd built around herself. Her therapist's instructions echoed in her mind. Just 15 minutes. That's all I'm asking for. The sound of books being reorganized drew her attention to the contemporary fiction section. A man in a well-tailored charcoal suit stood there, methodically examining book covers and making notes on a tablet. Something about his focused demeanor made her pause. He handled each book with careful consideration, occasionally nodding to himself as if confirming private thoughts. Min-suk hadn't noticed her yet, absorbed in his task. His presence carried an air of purpose that seemed at odds with the casual atmosphere of the bookstore. A stack of selected books sat neatly arranged on a nearby table, post-it notes protruding from various pages. The scene intrigued her, a professional man doing what appeared to be serious work in a public bookstore. Their paths crossed when she accidentally knocked over one of his carefully arranged piles. The sound of books hitting the floor shattered her comfortable anonymity. "I'm sorry," she muttered, dropping to her knees to help gather the scattered volumes. Their hands reached for the same book, causing an awkward moment of hesitation. "No harm done," Min-suk said, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised her. "These things happen when you're surrounded by books." He smiled, revealing subtle laugh lines around his eyes. "I'm actually glad for the interruption. I've been staring at these covers so long, they're starting to blur together." Against her better judgment, Soo-yeon found herself asking, "Are you a reviewer?" The question surprised her as much as him. It was the first genuine interaction she'd initiated with a stranger in weeks. Min-suk straightened the last of the fallen books before responding. "CEO of Hanjin Publishing, actually. I like to do my own scouting sometimes. Keeps me connected to what's really happening in literature." He extended his hand. Min-suk Park. The name registered immediately. Hanjin Publishing was one of the largest publishing houses in Seoul. Soo-yeon hesitated before shaking his hand, suddenly self-conscious of her casual appearance and unwashed hair. "Soo-yeon Kim," she replied, fighting the urge to flee. "Would you like to join me for coffee?" The invitation came naturally, accompanied by a gesture toward the store's cafe. "I could use a fresh perspective on some of these selections." His tone was professional, NAL yet friendly, lacking the pity or curiosity she'd grown accustomed to seeing in people's eyes when they learned who she was. The cafe area was quiet, with only a few other customers scattered at distant tables. Min-suk ordered an Americano for himself and waited for Soo-yeon to choose, a simple green tea. They settled at a corner table, the stack of books between them like a barrier. "So, what brings you to the bookstore today?" Min-suk asked, arranging the books into neat piles. The question was innocent enough, but Soo-yeon felt her throat tighten. How could she explain that this was her first time leaving her apartment in weeks? That she was here only because her therapist had insisted? Instead, she focused on the books before them. "These are all debut authors," she observed, noting the promotional statements on their covers. The familiar territory of literary discussion provided a safe haven. "You have a good eye," Min-suk replied, genuine interest crossing his features. "What's your connection to the publishing world?" The question hung in the air. Soo-yeon wrapped her hands around her teacup, drawing comfort from its warmth. "I'm a writer," she said finally, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "Or, at least, I was." Something in her tone must have registered with Min-suk. He didn't press for details, instead steering the conversation toward the current state of contemporary literature. Their discussion flowed naturally, touching on themes of personal narrative and the healing power of storytelling. For the first time in weeks, Soo-yeon found herself engaged in a conversation that didn't revolve around her personal tragedy. As their cups emptied, Min-suk pulled out a business card. "I enjoyed our discussion," he said, sliding it across the table. "If you're ever interested in sharing your work, I'd be happy to take a look." The offer was professional, but there was something else in his expression. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. Soo-yeon took the card, feeling its weight in her hand. The interaction had lasted less than an hour, but something had shifted. The world outside her apartment suddenly seemed less threatening, though the thought of returning home still tugged at her consciousness. The community center's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the circle of metal folding chairs. Soo-yeon sat rigid in her seat, listening to strangers share stories that echoed her own pain. The support group hadn't been her idea, another suggestion from her therapist, but after her unexpected encounter with Min-suk, she found herself more willing to try new things. The group leader, a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Park, maintained a gentle but firm presence. "Remember," she would say at the start of each session, "healing isn't linear. Some days we move forward, others we step back, but we're all here to support each other through both." These words resonated with Soo-yeon, who found herself returning week after week, though she hadn't yet spoken. During her third session, something changed. A new member shared a story about discovering her husband's affair with her sister, and the familiar ache in Soo-yeon's chest pushed words past her lips before she could stop them. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. She had been so quiet in previous sessions that some members seemed surprised to hear her speak. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like water breaking through a dam. She spoke about the betrayal, about her mother, about the isolation. Her hands trembled as she described finding her husband's confession note, the way her world had collapsed in on itself. The group listened without judgment, offering silent support through nods and understanding looks. Meanwhile, Min-suk had become an unexpected constant in her life. Their coffee meetings, initially focused on literature and publishing, gradually evolved into something more personal. He never pushed her to discuss her trauma, but his presence offered a safe space where she could exist without the weight of others' expectations. During one of their meetings, Min-suk suggested she write about her experiences. "Not for publication," he clarified, seeing her immediate resistance. "Just for yourself. Sometimes the act of putting words to paper helps us make sense of things that seem senseless." He spoke from experience, sharing how writing had helped him through his own divorce years earlier. The idea took root. That evening, Soo-yeon opened her laptop for the first time in months. The blank document stared back at her, but this time, instead of overwhelming her, it felt like an invitation. She began typing, hesitantly at first, then with increasing urgency. The words weren't perfect. They were raw, messy, and emotional, but they were honest. Her writing became a nightly ritual. After support group meetings, she would return home and transform her emotions into words. The story began to take shape, a novel about betrayal, yes, but also about resilience and the complicated nature of family bonds. The protagonist's journey mirrored her own, though she changed enough details to maintain distance. Min-suk never asked to read her work, but his influence was evident in her growing confidence. During their discussions, he shared insights about the publishing industry and the power of authentic storytelling. "The best books," he would say, "are the ones that make readers feel less alone in their experiences." The support group became a testing ground for her developing voice. Each shared story, each moment of vulnerability, added layers to her understanding of human nature. She began to see how different people process similar pain in unique ways. These observations found their way into her writing, adding depth to her characters. However, the writing process wasn't without its challenges. Some nights, the words wouldn't come. The cursor would blink accusingly on the screen as memories of her mother's betrayal overwhelmed her. During these moments, she would remember Mrs. Park's words about healing not being linear. One particularly difficult evening, after struggling with a chapter about mother-daughter relationships, Soo-yeon reached out to Min-suk. Their conversation over the phone lasted hours, touching on topics of family, forgiveness, and the complexity of human emotions. His perspective helped her see her story from different angles, though the pain remained raw. The manuscript grew steadily, becoming both a record of her healing journey and a work of fiction in its own right. But each time she considered showing it to someone, even Minsuk, fear would grip her heart. The thought of others reading her pain, judging her experiences, seemed unbearable. In the support group, Mrs. Park noticed the change in Soo-yeon's demeanor. "You're carrying yourself differently," she observed after one session. "There's strength in your voice now." Other group members agreed, commenting on how her shared experiences had helped them in their own healing processes. The drive to her mother's house felt like navigating through a minefield of memories. Each familiar street corner and landmark triggered flashbacks of happier times, family dinners, holiday celebrations, moments when their relationship hadn't been tainted by betrayal. Soo-yeon gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white as she approached the house she'd grown up in. Her mother's garden looked immaculate as always, roses blooming despite the emotional devastation that had occurred within these walls. The sight of her mother's car parked in the driveway, the same car she'd probably used to meet Dong-hyun, made bile rise in Soo-yeon's throat. She sat in her car for several minutes, gathering courage while the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway. The door opened before she could knock. Her mother stood there, looking smaller than Soo-yeon remembered, dark circles under her eyes matching her daughter's. "Soo-yeon," she breathed, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I didn't think you'd come." The living room remained unchanged, family photos still displayed proudly on the walls. Soo-yeon noticed her wedding photo had been removed, a small mercy. They sat across from each other, the coffee table between them like a demilitarized zone. The silence stretched uncomfortably until her mother attempted to pour tea with trembling hands. "Why?" The question escaped Soo-yeon's lips, carrying months of accumulated pain. "Of all the men in the world, why him? Why my husband?" Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the emotion she'd tried to contain. Her mother's response came quietly, almost rehearsed. "It wasn't planned. We never meant to hurt you." The familiar excuses ignited something in Soo-yeon's chest. "Never meant to hurt me?" The words exploded from her. "You're my mother. You're supposed to protect me from pain, not cause it. Did you think about me at all? Did either of you consider what this would do to me?" The questions poured out, each one carrying years of trust shattered in an instant. Her mother's composure cracked. "Of course I thought about you. Every moment, every decision. I hated myself for feeling what I felt, but I couldn't stop it. I tried, Soo-yeon. I tried so hard." Tears streamed down her face, makeup smearing as she wiped them away. The sight of her mother's distress brought no satisfaction. Instead, it added another layer to Soo-yeon's pain. How had they arrived at this point? When had their relationship become so fragile that it could shatter like this? Later that week, in her therapist's office, Soo-yeon recounted the confrontation. The therapist listened carefully before asking, "What do you think you're really angry about?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "I'm angry about the betrayal, about them going behind my back, about—" "Yes," her therapist interrupted gently. "But beneath that, what else?" The realization hit her slowly. "I'm angry that she didn't choose me," Soo-yeon whispered. "A mother is supposed to choose her child over everything else, isn't she?" The session continued with this new understanding, exploring the complex layers of mother-daughter relationships and the expectations they carry. Her therapist helped her see how shame and guilt had become tangled with her anger, creating a knot of emotions that seemed impossible to unravel. Minsuk's literary event invitation arrived at the perfect moment, offering an escape from the emotional aftermath of the confrontation. The prospect of immersing herself in the literary world, even briefly, felt like a lifeline. When she shared her mother's words with him over coffee, his response provided a new perspective. "Sometimes people make choices that hurt us not because they don't love us, but because they're human," he said. "It doesn't excuse their actions, but understanding this might help you heal." His words followed her home, mixing with her therapist's insights and her own evolving understanding of the situation. That night, she wrote furiously, pouring her complicated emotions into her manuscript. The scene of confrontation between her protagonist and her mother became more nuanced, layered with the understanding that pain often flows both ways. The literary event transformed the local convention center into a maze of book displays and author panels. Soo-yeon entered cautiously, Min-suk's event pass hanging around her neck. The atmosphere buzzed with creative energy as writers, publishers, and literary enthusiasts mingled freely. Despite her initial hesitation, she found herself drawn to the discussions about craft and storytelling. During a panel on memoir writing, Soo-yeon sat in the back row, absorbing every word. The featured author, a woman in her 60s, spoke about transforming personal tragedy into universal truth. Our deepest wounds, she explained, often become our most powerful stories. The words resonated deeply with Soo-yeon, who had filled 3 notebooks with her own painful truths. Between sessions, she encountered other writers who shared their struggles with vulnerability in writing. A young author described his journey of writing about his father's abandonment, while another discussed her book about surviving domestic violence. Their openness about their pain made Soo-yeon's own experience feel less isolating. The afternoon workshop focused on emotional authenticity in fiction. The facilitator asked participants to write a scene they'd been avoiding. Soo-yeon's hand trembled as she wrote about the moment she first suspected something between her mother and Dong-hyun, the lingering touches, the private jokes, the way they fell silent when she entered a room. Reading it aloud to her small group, she noticed how others nodded in recognition of the universal feelings of betrayal and discovery. Min-suk observed her throughout the day, maintaining a respectful distance while ensuring she felt supported. During the lunch break, he approached her table with a carefully wrapped package. "I thought you might find this interesting," he said, sliding it across to her. Inside was a first edition of The Weight of Ink by Rachel Kadish, a novel about secrets, betrayal, and the power of written words across generations. The gift sparked a conversation about how different authors handle similar themes. Min-suk shared his perspective as both a publisher and a reader, explaining how the most impactful stories often come from places of deep personal truth. "Your story matters," he told her, "not just for you, but for anyone who's ever felt betrayed by those they trusted most." Inspired by the day's events, Soo-yeon returned home and opened her laptop. The words flowed differently now, charged with new understanding. She wrote about her mother not as a villain, but as a complex woman capable of both love and betrayal. The chapter emerged raw and honest, exploring the gray areas between right and wrong, love and betrayal, forgiveness and self-preservation. That night, she allowed herself to read through her entire manuscript for the first time. The story had evolved from a simple tale of betrayal into an exploration of human complexity. Her protagonist's journey mirrored her own growth, from victim to survivor, from daughter to individual, from broken to healing. Min-suk's gift sat on her bedside table, its presence a reminder that stories of pain and resilience had always found their way into print, helping others feel less alone. She remembered the panel discussions, the workshops, the conversations with other writers, each interaction confirming that her experience, though personal, touched on universal themes. The following morning, she emailed her therapist about her breakthrough at the event. Writing about her pain had seemed impossible months ago, but now it felt necessary, not just for her healing, but perhaps for others wrestling with similar betrayals. The thought of her words potentially helping another person gave purpose to her suffering. The decision to publish her book came gradually, like dawn breaking after a long night. Soo-yeon sat in Min-suk's office at Hanjin Publishing, her manuscript placed carefully on his desk. The office reflected his personality, organized but welcoming, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a view of Seoul's skyline. She watched as he read the final chapter, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched until Min-suk finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "This is powerful work," he said, his voice carrying the weight of professional judgment. "But are you ready for what publishing means? Once it's out there, You can't take it back. His question forced her to confront the reality of making her pain public. The manuscript contained not just her story, but the intimate details of her family's breakdown. Though names had been changed and events fictionalized, anyone who knew her would recognize the truth beneath the narrative. I don't know if I'll ever be completely ready, she admitted, her fingers tracing the edge of her chair. But keeping it inside isn't helping anyone, not me, not others who might be going through something similar. The confidence in her voice surprised her. As they discussed publication details, Min-suk maintained strict professionalism, though Soo-yeon noticed how his gaze lingered when she spoke passionately about certain passages. The dynamic between them had shifted subtly over the months, professional boundaries blurring into something more complex but undefined. That evening, they shared dinner at a quiet restaurant near the publishing house. The conversation drifted from book marketing strategies to more personal territories. Min-suk spoke about his own experiences with publishing difficult stories, revealing a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. I was married once, he said, pushing his food around his plate. She left me for my best friend. It nearly destroyed me. The confession hung between them, heavy with shared understanding. That's why I recognized something in you that first day in the bookstore, that look of someone carrying an impossible weight. Soo-yeon felt her defenses wavering. Min-suk had become more than just a publisher or friend. He represented possibility, the chance that life could offer something new, something genuine. But the thought of opening herself to potential hurt again made her physically recoil. I see the way you look at me, she said quietly, addressing the unspoken tension between them. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something too. But I'm not ready. I might not be ready for a long time. Min-suk's response came without hesitation. I'm not asking for anything. Your healing comes first, always. I just want you to know that not everyone will hurt you the way they did. Their conversation turned deeply personal, exploring their respective traumas and hopes. Min-suk shared how publishing had become his way of helping others find their voice, while Soo-yeon spoke about her fear of trusting again. The evening ended with a greater understanding between them, but also with clear boundaries established. Back home, Soo-yeon realized that publishing her book wasn't just about sharing her story, it was about reclaiming her narrative. Every word she had written was an act of defiance against the shame and silence that had initially consumed her. The thought of her mother reading it still caused anxiety to curl in her stomach, but it no longer paralyzed her. The day of the book launch arrived with an intensity that made the air feel electric. The venue, a prestigious bookstore in downtown Seoul, had been transformed for the evening event. Rows of chairs faced a small podium, and copies of Soo-yeon's novel, The Betrayal of Blood, were displayed prominently at the entrance. The cover, a minimalist design featuring a shattered mirror reflecting a family photograph, captured the essence of her story. Backstage, Soo-yeon paced in a small preparation room, her new dress feeling simultaneously too tight and too loose. Min-suk had arranged everything professionally, but his personal touches were evident, from the carefully selected moderator to the intimate size of the venue. He understood her need to maintain control over how her story would be presented. The crowd gathering outside exceeded expectations. Through a crack in the curtain, Soo-yeon spotted familiar faces from her support group, several literary critics, and even a few well-known authors. The sight of empty seats near the front, reserved for family, made her stomach clench. She hadn't expected her mother to come, but the absence still stung. Just before the event was scheduled, to begin movement at the entrance caught her attention. Her mother slipped in quietly, wearing the blue dress Soo-yeon had given her last Christmas. Their eyes met briefly across the room before both looked away. The air seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Min-suk approached Soo-yeon with a glass of water. Remember, he said softly, tonight isn't about them. It's about you finding your voice. His presence steadied her, though she noticed his own tension when he spotted her mother in the audience. The introduction went smoothly, with the moderator contextualizing the novel within contemporary Korean literature. When Soo-yeon took the podium, the rustling of the audience settled into expectant silence. Her prepared speech felt dry in her mouth until she looked up and saw Mrs. Park from the support group giving her an encouraging nod. I chose to read a passage that speaks to the heart of this story, Soo-yeon began, her voice growing stronger with each word. She opened the book to a dog-eared page, one she'd rewritten countless times. The betrayal wasn't in the act itself, but in the thousand small moments that led to it. It was in the subtle shifts of loyalty, the invisible redistributions of trust. By the time the truth emerged, the damage had already been done in whispers, in glances, in the quiet death of what we thought was unbreakable. As she read, she felt rather than saw her mother's reaction. The words, sharp as knives when written, took on a different quality in the public reading, less accusatory, more contemplative. The audience leaned forward, caught in the universal truth of betrayal and its aftermath. When she finished the passage, the silence held for a moment before applause broke out. Through tears she hadn't realized were falling, Soo-yeon saw several audience members wiping their eyes. Her mother sat perfectly still, hands clasped in her lap, face unreadable. The question and answer session revealed how deeply her story had resonated. People shared their own experiences with family betrayals, their struggles with forgiveness. Each question helped Soo-yeon understand that by exposing her personal pain, she'd created a space for others to acknowledge theirs. Min-suk managed the session expertly, stepping in when questions became too personal, ensuring Soo-yeon maintained her composure. His protective instincts were professional, but carried an undercurrent of personal care that didn't go unnoticed by the attentive audience. After the reading, Soo-yeon found herself face-to-face with her mother in a quiet corner of the bookstore. The post-event crowd created a buffer of white noise around them, offering a semblance of privacy. Her mother held a copy of the book, her fingers running over the embossed title as if trying to absorb its meaning through touch. "You wrote about me," her mother said, her voice carrying no accusation, only a deep weariness. "About us." The observation hung between them, neither question nor complaint. Soo-yeon noticed the tremor in her mother's hands, the same tremor she'd inherited, now visible as both women struggled to maintain composure. The conversation that followed stripped away months of carefully constructed defenses. Her mother spoke first, words tumbling out like water breaking through a dam. She described her own journey, the loneliness in her marriage to Soo-yeon's father, the unexpected connection with Dong-hyun, the self-loathing that accompanied every secret meeting. Each revelation peeled back layers of the story Soo-yeon thought she knew. "I destroyed something precious," her mother acknowledged, tears falling freely now. "Not just your marriage, but your trust in me, in love itself." She reached for Soo-yeon's hand, then stopped herself, uncertain of boundaries. "Reading your words, seeing our story through your eyes, I finally understand the magnitude of what I did." Soo-yeon found herself sharing too, explaining how the betrayal had altered her percep. Tie-in of everything she thought she knew about family, love, and loyalty. The words came easier now, refined by months of writing and therapy. "Every happy memory became suspect," she explained. "Every family photo, every shared moment. I started questioning when it all began to change." Their conversation shifted between Korean and English, a habit from Soo-yeon's childhood when difficult emotions needed the distance of a second language. They spoke about Dong-hyun too, though his name felt foreign on their tongues now. He had moved to Busan, their mother revealed, unable to bear the weight of what he'd done to either of them. As they talked, something subtle began to change. The sharp edges of their pain didn't disappear, but they became more manageable, like sea glass worn smooth by waves. Laughter emerged unexpectedly when they recalled a shared memory, surprising them both with its authenticity. From across the room, Min-suk observed their interaction with careful attention. His publisher's instincts recognized the potential for healing in their conversation, but his growing feelings for Soo-yeon made him acutely aware of her vulnerability. He maintained his distance, while staying close enough to intervene, if needed. Their reconciliation wasn't complete. Too much had happened for simple forgiveness, but they found a way to acknowledge their shared humanity. Soo-yeon's mother spoke about her own therapy journey, the work she'd been doing to understand her actions. In turn, Soo-yeon shared how writing had helped her process her pain. The evening ended with an awkward but genuine hug, their first physical contact in months. Both women pulled back with tear-stained faces, but their eyes held something new, understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of forgiveness. They made plans to meet for coffee the following week, a small step toward rebuilding their relationship. The success of the book launch rippled through Seoul's literary community. As Soo-yeon prepared to leave the venue, an elderly man approached her with purposeful steps. He introduced himself as Park Jin-woo, editorial director of one of Korea's most prestigious publishing houses. His presence at the launch wasn't coincidental. Word of her manuscript had circulated among industry professionals for weeks. "Your work speaks to a universal experience that transcends cultural boundaries," Jin-woo said, handing her his business card with both hands in traditional Korean fashion. "We'd be interested in discussing international rights and translations." The offer hung in the air, representing opportunities Soo-yeon had never imagined when she first began writing her story. Min-suk watched this interaction from nearby, his expression a complex mixture of pride and concern. The success of her book meant she would soon be thrust into a broader literary world, one that would demand more of her time and emotional energy. As other publishers and agents approached her throughout the evening, his protective instincts warred with his professional understanding of the industry's mechanics. Later, as the crowd thinned and staff began clearing chairs, Min-suk found Soo-yeon alone in the now-quiet reading area. The evening's excitement had left her looking both exhilarated and exhausted. He sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance that had become both comfort and torture. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice carrying the weight of months of unspoken feelings. "Working with you, watching you transform your pain into art, it's changed me too." The confession emerged carefully, each word chosen with deliberate precision. "I find myself thinking about you in ways that go beyond our professional relationship." Soo-yeon's response was gentle but firm. "I care about you, Min-suk. You've become important to me in ways I never expected." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But I'm still learning who I am without the weight of betrayal. I need to understand myself before I can offer anything real to someone else." Min-suk nodded, understanding flowing between them. "I'm not asking for promises," he replied. "I just wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. Not as your publisher, not as just a friend, but as someone who sees your strength and values your journey." The moment was interrupted by another well-wisher, allowing both of them to retreat to safer emotional ground. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and business cards. Several literary magazines requested interviews, and a university professor invited her to speak to their creative writing class. Amid the professional opportunities, Soo-yeon felt the need to maintain boundaries. She declined several immediate interview requests, explaining her need for personal space. Her therapist had warned her about the emotional toll of constantly revisiting her trauma through publicity, and she was determined to protect her healing process. That night, alone in her apartment, Soo-yeon faced the quiet aftermath of success. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends and industry contacts, but she found herself drawn to her writing desk. Opening her laptop, she began a new document, not another story of pain, but an exploration of healing, of finding strength in vulnerability, of learning to trust again. The discovery of her mother's diary occurred by accident. While helping to clean out old storage boxes, Soo-yeon found the worn leather journal tucked behind family photo albums. The diary's pages had yellowed with age, its entries dating back 25 years. Her mother's handwriting, younger and more urgent than Soo-yeon remembered, filled each page with secrets that would reshape their story. As she read through the entries, a different narrative emerged. Her mother, then a young woman in her 30s, wrote about her own experience with betrayal, not as the betrayer, but as the betrayed. The entries detailed her discovery that her closest friend, someone she had trusted completely, had begun an affair with Soo-yeon's father. The diary entry from April 1999 particularly stood out. "Today I confirmed what I've suspected for months. Mija and Young-ho have been meeting in secret. The evidence was there in his phone. Messages I wasn't meant to see. The worst part isn't the betrayal itself, but how it makes me question every memory. Were they laughing at me during our family dinners? When did their feelings begin? I look at photos from last summer's vacation and wonder if it had already started then. How did I not see it? The parallels between her mother's past pain and Soohyun's present situation created a dizzying sense of history repeating itself. The diary revealed how her mother had chosen to stay in the marriage for Soohyun's sake, burying her pain beneath layers of routine and responsibility. Her father and Mija eventually ended their affair, but the trust in their marriage never fully recovered. This revelation cast her mother's actions with Dong-hyun in a new light. The cycle of betrayal had come full circle, with her mother unconsciously recreating the very pain she had once endured. Soohyun found herself reaching for her phone, fingers hovering over her mother's number as questions multiplied in her mind. Their meeting the next day took place in their old family home's garden, among the roses her mother had always tended so carefully. When confronted with the diary, her mother's face drained of color. "I thought I had lost that years ago," she whispered, touching the worn cover with trembling fingers. The conversation that followed brought forth decades of buried truth. Her mother spoke about how the experience had altered her understanding of love and betrayal. "Perhaps that's why I couldn't stop myself with Dong-hyun," she admitted. "Part of me was still that wounded young woman, seeking something to fill the void your father's betrayal left behind." Understanding bloomed between them like the roses surrounding them, beautiful, but not without thorns. Their shared experience of betrayal created a bridge across the chasm that had separated them. Soohyun saw her mother now not just as the woman who had betrayed her, but as someone who had also been betrayed, who had carried her own wounds for decades. Min-suk, who had become their unexpected confidant, offered a publisher's perspective when Soohyun shared this development with him. "Sometimes our deepest wounds become the lens through which we view the world," he observed. "Your mother's story, like yours, is about more than betrayal. It's about how pain can echo through generations until someone finds the courage to break the cycle." As evening settled over the garden, mother and daughter sat together, their shadows merging on the grass. The diary lay between them, its pages containing a truth that had finally set them both free. Their relationship would never be the same as before, but perhaps it could be something new, something stronger, built on understanding rather than blind trust. This revelation became the epilogue of Soohyun's story, transforming her book from a tale of personal betrayal into an exploration of how pain and healing can travel through generations. As she wrote the final pages, she understood that some stories don't end with neat conclusions, but with new beginnings. Min-suk waited patiently in the background, understanding that Soohyun's journey of healing had opened a new chapter, one that might eventually include him, but only when she was ready to write that story.